In this part, I'll walk you through setting up the iPad for your artist, and I'll share some tips for keeping your iPad safe. I think it goes without saying, but you'll need an iPad. Just about any iPad will work, but it needs to be at least one of the ones listed on Procreate's website. Procreate is the art app your young artist will be using. You'll need to purchase and install that as well, but fortunately it isn't very expensive and it's a one-time purchase, not a subscription. You need not splurge for an iPad Pro. That's overkill for a kid, and Procreate won't have any use for all of that power. A regular iPad should work just fine, but it doesn't support the Apple Pencil Pro. There are other pens that are compatible with the regular iPad, but they may not give you a proper drawing experience. I'll come back to this. A regular iPad might also be a little sluggish if you plan to use it for more than just art. An iPad mini is too small for art, in my opinion, but if portability is your main concern, it would suffice as well. I'd recommend an iPad Air M2 or later, which is what I am using during my demonstrations. There isn't a huge difference between the 13 and 11-inch screens, but keep in mind that smaller hands might have an easier time controlling and keeping a smaller tablet safe. Coming back to the Apple Pencil Pro, that's an additional cost, but it's worth it. It's fine to paint with a finger, but the Apple Pencil Pro feels more intuitive and gives young artists more freedom to create. I highly recommend you provide one of these to your young artist, but it's not required to follow along with my course. There are other Apple Pencils and even some unofficial pens that work on iPads, but they don't all have the same features. I would just play it safe and get the Apple Pencil Pro if your iPad supports it. You can watch my review of the iPad to get a feel for the features each pen supports. We all know iPads are not cheap, and kids and even adults have accidents. If you're not comfortable leaving your young artist unattended with an iPad, then don't. I won't eat up too much time going over all of the ways your iPad could get obliterated, but just be aware of some of the obvious ones like dropping the iPad, stepping on the screen, hitting the screen too hard, scratching the screen with rough or sharp objects, food hands, submersion in water, and losing the iPad or Apple Pencil. I would thoroughly explain to your young artist the rules around using the iPad and how they are responsible for keeping it safe. Getting a case to protect your iPad would be a worthwhile investment. I am using one of these cases with a built-in keyboard that also functions as a stand. Keeping the iPad on the stand on a desk or tabletop would lessen the chances of it being dropped. This one is made by Logitech, but lots of companies make these. Just make sure it's at least somewhat thick so it can withstand impacts to some degree. The case also keeps the iPad screen from making contact with something like the floor if left face down. You can also fold the case so that it covers the screen. Whether it's in a case like this or a protective pouch, I would encourage young artists to put their iPad away when they are done. Scratches on the iPad screen are inevitable. Microscopic scratches are superficial and won't affect the usability of the iPad. Those are pretty much unavoidable. What I would be concerned with is keeping the screen clean. Young artists may have messy hands that leave debris on the screen. This on its own can cause scratches when rubbed into the screen with a finger or Apple Pencil, but more coarse debris like dust or sand can adhere to something like pizza sauce or honey. It may not always be practical, but it would be good to encourage hand washing before using the iPad, or at least don't allow eating while making art. Even if you can avoid food on the screen, oils from our skin naturally build up. You'll need to be prepared to clean the screen as often as needed to maximize the lifespan of your screen. For a light cleaning, use a clean, dry microfiber cloth. You can slightly dampen the cloth with water for tougher cleaning. I keep one of these cloths next to my iPad in my office. That's how often I use it. Even a deep scratch wouldn't be the end of the world, and the iPad would still work fine, so don't stress about scratches, just be aware of how you can avoid them. Screen protectors are available, and would certainly add a degree of protection. However, the adhesive ones can be tricky to apply and eventually wear down anyway. It might also be hard for little fingers to resist picking at the edges or peeling it off. Considering they are not cheap and it could be a recurring cost, I don't know that it's a worthwhile investment. Screen protectors are not essential in my opinion, but you can decide if they're right for you. The Apple Pencil Pro attaches magnetically to the iPad and holds on fairly tight. so that should make it easy to keep track of. This is one of the most convenient ways to store the pen I have ever seen. There's also the consideration that this is likely your iPad, and it might have your files or private information on it. You'll want to take precautions to keep your data from being deleted or unauthorized apps from being accessed. Apple has documentation about parental controls you can check out if you're interested. If your iPad or Apple Pencil Pro are lost, you may be able to track them down using Apple's Find My service. That covers what you'll need to get going on this course. If you've acquired all of the hardware and software required, and you have prepared your young artist for this course, we can start setting up the iPad. I'll assume you've already gone through the process of setting up a new iPad. That would be things like creating an Apple account, enabling Wi-Fi, setting up parental controls, pairing the Apple Pencil, and things like that. There are plenty of resources out there for that, so I won't be covering the process here. You should have also installed Procreate, and it should be easily accessible on the iPad home screen so your young artist can find it without having to hunt around. If possible, you may want to remove the shortcuts for everything but Procreate and any other essential apps. Now I will walk you through some of the settings that I feel will provide a more comfortable drawing experience, reduce distractions, and lessen the potential for anything to get accidentally messed up. Swipe from the top right of the iPad screen downward and to the left. This opens a quick settings menu where you can adjust the screen brightness. Tap and hold on the brightness slider to see more options. You don't want the screen to be too dim or it will be hard to see. A screen that is too bright is hard on the eyes and wastes battery life. Choose a setting that works best for your young artist's environment. True Tone and the Auto Brightness feature found under the accessibility settings can automatically adjust the screen. But this can also create confusion if the brightness and color change and the artist doesn't understand why. I would recommend just leaving it set on the brighter end, but not full brightness. That should be adequate for indoor use. At night, you'll want the screen dimmer, and you may want to enable night shift to protect from the effects of blue light. Going back to the quick menu, I would also consider whether you want rotation lock disabled or enabled. When disabled, rotating the iPad will cause the Procreate tools and menus to reorder to a vertical orientation. This is essential if your artist wants to draw in a portrait orientation. Automatically adjusting the interface is fine if your artist understands why this is happening, but it could cause some confusion or frustration for others who might only care to draw in landscape mode. These settings can always be revisited if you aren't sure how to set them initially. Let's go to the iPad settings and look under Display and Brightness. Another key setting to consider is the Auto Lock. When enabled, this will automatically lock the iPad after a set amount of time. If you don't want to have to keep entering a PIN, then either make the PIN easy for your young artist to remember, like their birth year, or disable Auto Lock. The downside to disabling Auto Lock is that if the tablet was left unattended or was stolen while unlocked, someone could access the iPad. You can change the PIN under Settings, Touch ID, and Passcode. You can change the options to make the PIN shorter. Pressing the power button will lock the iPad, so that's also something to be aware of. I would also ensure that Erase Data is disabled because it activates after 10 unsuccessful PIN attempts. Next, under Multitasking and Gestures, let's disable some of the iPad gestures because they might be triggered accidentally and cause problems. There are also some important settings under Apple Pencil if you will be using one. Squeeze and double tap are pen shortcuts that could be useful for artists who are old enough to understand how they work. But for younger artists, they will probably get triggered frequently and accidentally. I'd recommend keeping hover enabled unless your artist is bothered by the brush cursor. I would disable the rest of the effects. Scribble can be used to input text with handwriting, but it's not always accurate and may cause more frustration. You may want to just leave it disabled so that it's not a problem. There are also some pencil gestures that could trigger accidentally. I'd disable these too. If you look under iCloud, you may want to customize this a bit so that you are backing up your artist's work automatically. Remove anything that you don't need to back up so that you don't use up the free storage. If you are paying for additional storage, this may not be a concern. You may also want to look under Wallet and Apple Pay and make sure it's not set up to allow your young artist to make purchases online. Procreate has its own iPad settings you can customize. You'll need to add permissions for Procreate to access a Dropbox if you plan to use that for cloud storage. There are some other settings in here you may want to review, such as accessibility options for artists who may benefit from them. Now let's open Procreate and set a few options here. The settings can be found in the wrench icon in the top left. Look under Preferences. You can feel free to choose your own preferences, but I'll share how I set mine. I am right-handed, so I use the right-hand interface. If your artist is a lefty, then toggle this to left-hand mode to move the sidebar to the right. I find the brush cursor useful since the brush size can be much larger or smaller than the Apple Pencil or a fingertip. The cursor makes it more predictable what size stroke you will get, and it helps with drawing accuracy, so I would recommend leaving it enabled. If it's a distraction or bothers your artist, then disable it. If you will be using the brush cursor, then go to Advanced Cursor Settings. Here you'll want to show the cursor for both hovering and painting unless you want to change that. For brush outline style, high contrast is the easiest to see, but you can also use the selected color. Under Pressure and Smoothing is where you can customize the pressure sensitivity of the Apple Pencil. For the way I draw, I like to use an S-curve like this. It makes the Apple Pencil behave better, but you'll need to press a bit harder to get a pressure response. You can set this back to the default with the Reset All button. Try both and see what your artist prefers. This is a global setting that applies to all brushes in Procreate. You can also customize pressure per brush, but that's not something I cover in this course. You can also set global stabilization for all brushes. If your young artist needs a little assistance with dexterity, then you can add stabilization and/or motion filtering to make their lines less wobbly. I provide a very stable kid brush called the Pen that has stabilization applied. Unless you need every brush to be stable, I wouldn't set this globally as it will make all of the brushes feel less responsive. Under Gesture Controls, here's where you can customize the various gestures that control functions in Procreate. I give directions to use specific gestures throughout this course, so please match your settings to mine or explain to your artist that their shortcut is different. Disable everything in Smudge, Erase, Assisted Drawing, Quick Menu, Full Screen, Copy and Paste, Layer Select, and Hover. Under General, finger painting must be enabled for your artist to paint with their finger. If finger painting is interrupting drawing with the Apple Pencil, then disable this. If undo and redo are happening unexpectedly, you can disable their gestures here. You can disable the page rotation gesture and only allow it to zoom if that becomes troublesome. Under Eyedropper, this is used to sample colors from the screen. The easiest option is touch and hold, but you may customize this if you like. Quick Shape makes it easy to draw perfect lines and shapes. Draw and hold is the default. I'll explain some of these features like the eyedropper and quick shape in the advanced section of this course. Clear layer is something that should be easily accessible. I have selected the 4-finger tap since I find it to be the easiest to control for kids, but there are other options that may better suit your artist. It's always possible that someone curious could tinker with these properties, so you can always refer to this section of the video to recall what all of this should be set to. Tap on Done to apply these preferences. Under Selection Mask Visibility, you may want to set this around 40% so that it becomes obvious that the selection mode has been enabled by mistake. If you ever see zebra stripes like this, just tap on the selection mode to disable it. The Size and Opacity sidebar is helpful, and I will teach about it in my course. However, lowering the opacity to 0 will make brushes invisible, which could cause some frustration. Just as well, making the brush too big or too small may create problems, so if your artist struggles with this sidebar, you can disable it. The kid brushes I created for this course are set to default sizes, so you need not change any sidebar settings unless you want to. At this point, I think you and your artist are ready to start taking the course.